I'm just going to walk up there. Okay, I want to welcome everybody. A little bit of a late start, but we got going. I'll try not to move around. Yeah, so my name's Ted St. Rain, or Ted St. Rains, as it says out there on the billboard. And I basically drive around the country videotaping different conferences and things. And so I have a lot of exposure, a lot of different information, a lot of lectures, and good friends with pretty much everybody who's been on the Art Bell Show. And in the process, I basically compiled a lot of different information. On the internet, in fact, I used to run a computer bulletin board before the internet was even the internet. And people used to call me from all over the world to download like my UFO files, you know, like Bill Cooper's UFO file or something. And so as part of that, I basically have just had all these weird experiences, weird subjects that, you know, I like to talk about and stuff. And so one of them is Ancient Mysteries of North America. And my latest, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. That's the first half of the lecture. And then the second half of the lecture, it being Roswell, this is what I wanted to talk about originally, was time travel and the Roswell aliens. And so we'll also be talking about that as soon as we get through the first part, and then I'll fulfill that requirement, and then we'll get into the good stuff. So hopefully we won't run out of time. And so, you know, I was just featured on National Geographic last Thanksgiving, and we did, basically I'd written this book on ancient mysteries in North America, and I have copies here for like $5 or $10 if anybody wants any. And so National Geographic got a hold of this copy, and they happened to be doing a series, Is It Real?, exactly on the subject that I'd written the book on, which was ancient astronauts. And so they basically flew me down to Mexico. We talked all about the Anunnaki and Zachariah Sitchin and the Donga tribe I'll get into in a little while. And so that was always a lot of fun. And now, when you think of the ancient world, you think of the Babylonians and the Sumerians and these ancient religions. You don't really think of them being world travelers, when in fact they were. There's documents of the Chinese being in America and all these different, the Babylonians having trade routes, you know, to the new world and things. And so there's a lot of this evidence in the ancient world of them being seafaring nations. And now there's what's known as the diffusionist theory, that basically says that we came down through Alaska, you know, the Bering Strait, and basically came down. Whereas a lot of the researchers today feel that we actually landed like in Peru or where Brazil is, that like the Olmec civilization, and that was really the mother civilization, and everything from there basically migrated northward. And so I like to make the point that people go around the world to talk about ancient mysteries. Oh, you know. Victoria, can you go ahead and kill that light? That light shouldn't be on. Yeah, there you go. So people go all over the world talking about ancient mysteries. They go to Peru and Egypt and all these different places. And yet few people realize that there's a lot of artifacts and a lot of history, ancient American history, that would just baffle the mind if people had any idea that there used to be stuff right here, and there still is stuff here. Most of it's been in one way or another suppressed or hidden in one way or another. And so this guy here is Charles Fort, and he basically was interested in these kinds of things, and he coined a term named OOPArt, or an out-of-place artifact, which is like sometimes they dig up or they pump up from a well like a figurine that looks very human-like, and yet it was pumped from 300 feet below the earth. And so he spent a good portion of his life basically compiling these reports and compiled them in these huge volumes that he basically collected all these reports from the early 1900s and compiled them into several volumes. One of them is called the Book of the Damned, where he basically comes into a lot of different weird stuff. Anyway, and so a lot of you have heard about the woolly mammoths who were found in Siberia with petals, you know, buttercups frozen in their stomachs, you know, as though the pole had overnight, or there was a sudden flash freeze. And so we won't be talking much about this, but there's a lot of history about basically these flash freezes that happened in the past. Does anyone know where this is from or what this is? This is a giant skull that was found up in north of Nevada near a little place called Lovelock on Interstate 80, actually, as you come in out of Utah. And what there was a series of bat caves where bats would go hang out. And there was a number of these large, and this is like in 1910, 1920, and there was a large series of, what happened was that there's a lot of bat guano miners, and they would basically be mining the bat guano. And every so often they'd come across this large skeleton, like 10, 12, 13 feet long, and that had red hair apparently. And so of course, you know, the miners were there mining bat guano. They didn't care about them. They would send reports every so often out to the Smithsonian or some Berkeley University or something, and nobody really seemed too interested in them. So they were busy mining the bat guano, and they just set it aside. And so basically, eventually these scientists, you know, these universities eventually sent out some unofficial observers, but they were mostly interested in like part shards and things like this. And so one of the miners actually set up a museum that had artifacts, and I think this skull was even from there. But as is usually the case in like 1952, the museum burned down. A lot of the artifacts were lost and stolen. Not stolen, but destroyed. And so some of these artifacts can still be seen in a historical society in Boise or somewhere. And then this here is kind of interesting. This is a lump of coal that's about 300 million years old. And what you see there is in the right-hand side is basically what appears to be a human molar. And this molar is actually about 3 times human size, though. But of any indication that it seems to be a molar that's found in coal several hundred million years old. And this is not unusual. There's a lot of stuff that's been found in coal mines, and we'll get together, we'll talk soon about some other stuff in that area. This here, I believe this was in Texas. There on the left side of the screen, it appears to be a human femur bone, or one of the leg bones, basically that's probably 4 or 5 times human size. And so, of course, archaeology says, oh, that's not a human bone, that's some other kind of dinosaur bone or something. So there's a lot of so-called archaeologists that basically, crypto-archaeologists that look into these basically different things. And so throughout the past 1,000 years in North America, there's been a series of civilizations that have lived here. There was a Cahokia Mound complex near Illinois, or in Illinois, and in West Virginia there was a lot of grounds and mounds and different artifacts that were found in the mounds that tend to indicate that, yes, while there was a native people that lived here, there seemed to also be another group of people that were almost worshipped as gods by some of these native cultures. There was like the Mississippian culture, and there's these different cultures that lived in the area. And sometimes graves were found that were basically where there was, once again, a 12-foot skeleton that was decorated like he was some kind of god, because apparently they'd never seen something like that. And what's very interesting in this slide here is that at Grave Creek, West Virginia, one of the mounds actually has chambers in it much like the Great Pyramid of Egypt. And they've actually found this also down in Mexico at Teotihuacan and some of the other places, where very rarely do pyramids in America have any kind of chambers inside at all. They're mostly just earthen pyramids. But in some cases they do find them, and so it's interesting how almost like there was an Egyptian influence in some of the gravestones. And so these are Iberian or Minoan, they're also known as, and the Minoans were a very mysterious civilization that were in the area of Greece and Rome and those kind of places that were kind of like between civilizations. And we don't know too much about them at all, but we know that these may have been associated with the mound builders, these civilizations that were basically 2000 BC Greece area, were associated with mounds that were being built in the Americas. And so pretty much I classify my research into different areas. Like all this, what we've gone over much all known. I have a perfectly good explanation about where a lot of this stuff comes from, the mounds and something like that. Now there's other artifacts that have been found, much like the not the Caso Geo, but this one's called the San Pedro mummy, and it was found up in Wyoming in 1932. Some gold prospectors were out looking for gold, and they decided they were going to blast open some crevice or whatever, and they went in, and there was a small cavern in there, and they went in, and on a ledge in the cave, on a small ledge about 3 feet high, was this mummy here on the left, and there's the X-ray on the right. And what was so unusual about it was only about 30 inches high. It was basically a midget or a dwarf. But what's so unusual about it, after they examined it, once again this is 1932, after they examined it, the authorities that examined it said, well, this appears to be a mature male because its head is in proportion to its body. What happens when you're a child or when you're a very small child, your head is much larger in proportion to your body. And so this being, or whatever it might be, that apparently was revered because it was buried in this cave in Wyoming, seems to be very unusual. And so those are the kinds of things. And so here are some modern day stuffed dwarfs, you'd call them, or maybe they're alive. I think these ones are stuffed though. But anyway, so some other interesting history about America. On the north shore of Lake Superior in Michigan, there's a little peninsula out there. And the whole area is dotted by copper mines. And this is an example of one such copper mine. And what they are is open pit copper mines, where basically you would just dig for copper right out in the thing. And what's very unusual about copper is normally found only in ore form, and combined with bauxite or some other mineral that needs processing to basically get it out of the ore. And so what's unusual about this area of Michigan is that this is one of the only few areas in the world where copper is found in its raw form, in its nugget form, where you can literally go around and pick up nuggets of copper in the mine, which would be very useful for, like Vikings, for an example, if they needed to do it. What's so unusual about this particular site, and there's about 5,000 copper mines in this area that were mined in antiquity, and the Indians of the area had no use for the copper. They had no, there were no artifacts representing that the Indians were ever lived in the area. But what's so unusual about these, and also every copper mine in existence today in the area is working an old vein that was mined in prehistory. And the most unusual thing about this find is 500 million pounds, 500 million pounds of copper were extracted before apparently any white man had settled here, and basically just disappeared. And I think it was Jacques Vallée or one of those researchers from the 70s said that this was like the most mysterious mystery, that could be explained, because where did the copper go? And copper can be traced by its component, what's in it. And so they know that if they find a piece of copper in Greece that came from, Russia or something, they can trace that. And so this copper has never really been anywhere else in the world, and any artifacts that the Vikings left or anything like that. And so once again, the theory that I talk about in the book and the theory that I talked about on National Geographic is basically that the Anunnaki or the aliens came here, and they came here for mining. And so one of the metals they were after, of course, would be copper. And so back to mining, there's several reports in the literature of like coal mines, for example. In a coal mine, what they do is they just find a thread of coal, and they just mine it. And they just mine it, and they go down or up or whatever direction they want. And up in, I think this was in Montana, like 2 miles below the ground, or something like 6,000 or 8,000 feet below the ground, they encountered a large area that had oxidized coal, where apparently some oxygen got in, and you can tell because the oxidized coal tends to crumble and not be quite, as compact. And so what they found is, they continued digging, and they found a large tunnel, not unlike this one, of course, so this one's paved, but they found a large tunnel, and they were mining from like west to east, and this tunnel ran from like the southeast to the northwest, from like Denver to Washington State. This is the area that it was in. And so they found this large, like 40-foot circumference tunnel. Apparently somebody had mined in antiquity as well. that's apparently what it looked like. And so, and for anybody who doesn't want to pay $5 or $10 for the book, it's actually also online for free, mysteryofamerica.com. And you can probably also download this video and other videos I have there as well. And so here is just the, it was in Utah. And so at 8,500 feet, they found 2 tunnels. And the tunnels were 200 feet apart. And they had been basically mined from both sides, and there was no record of any activity in the area. So, oh, you know, Victoria, can you do me a favor and let, somehow when you leave, go let Tony know that he can just start that second tape, you know, just press the record buttons. I think he knows how to do it.
I'm sorry, he was talking to you while you were talking.
Yeah, I was saying, just let Tony know that, you know, there's a lecture starting in about a half an hour after Heiser's done, before I'm finished, so he can just figure it out. He'll be able to do it. Okay, so here's another tunnel. This one's in Massachusetts, a little place like Goshen, Massachusetts. And this tunnel was found like in 1940 or something. And it's somewhat interesting because the tunnels weren't level. And you would think that, you know, and the theory was, oh, it's an old slave tunnel or, you know, so, but the exquisite workmanship of the stone that was used to encase the tunnel, you know, and some people say, oh, it was a root cellar, but it's very unusual. And what happened is it went down and it went off one direction, as you see, and then went down and went off the other direction. And the tunnel seemed to go on for quite some time, and yet they were collapsed and they couldn't be explored further. And as many times the case is, this is just an example of the next story I was going to tell, that a very similar tunnel was found underneath. They were excavating for a parking lot somewhere in North Carolina or something, and they found a very interesting tunnel like this. And of course they kind of just explored it a little bit, and then they were there to build a parking lot, so they just paved it over. Much like, I don't know if anybody heard about the when they tore down a big condominium complex down in Miami, and they found an ancient Native American ritual circle and stuff. What's so interesting about that story, and the landowner was just furious because, you know, once you get this kind of stuff, you can't do land. You know, it's like he made a mistake by tearing the thing down. What's interesting is I researched that story, and I found that 30 years ago, before the condominium was even built, and I think, once again, I don't know the exact location, but there was a story of about a condominium that was being built and of a very similar structure being found, and they went in, did cursory excavations, and then they just built the condominium on top of it. And now it's interesting that they tore it down. So they do that a lot. They'll just go in, and I've got many stories about the Smithsonian getting involved, and next thing you know, it's been, well, I'll tell that story now. There's the Florida swamp ape. No, not the. Well, that's another story. The Florida mummies. I forget they have a name. Poanka mummies. I don't think they're in here. But what happened? And these were like Native American artifacts and stuff, and yet they had some tools with them that were like cast iron or something like that. And so a researcher at the Smithsonian in the 1980s. And said, hey, you know, we'd like to look at the stuff. And the Smithsonian, first they said, oh, we can't find it, you know, in our collection or whatever. And then he went back a few years later, oh, we did find it, but unfortunately it's in a warehouse. It's been contaminated with asbestos, and it won't be ready for like 15 years or something. They always have some kind of reason why it's not available, so it's interesting. But anyway, so this is an interesting one. Has anybody heard of the city under the Grand Canyon, besides a couple of hardcore people in the front? And so, notice they got here early, sat in the front. It's all my friends here, you know, every one of them. And so, so basically, what happened is in 1909, you can see here, March 12th, the Arizona Gazette ran an article about and this was actually an ex-Smithsonian. Wasn't a curator, he wasn't a janitor, he was something else. And basically, this guy was floating down the Colorado River from Utah. He came down from Utah. This is before there were a bunch of dams. There was a couple dams, and he was a prospector. He was looking for minerals. And so, you know, you wouldn't normally stop your boat unless you're camping to go look for minerals, but that's what he would do. He'd stop every few miles and go hike up in the cliffs and look for, you know, some color. What you're looking for is gold color in the hills. And so basically he's floating down, and apparently he got to where where he could look down on the river. You couldn't see the thing from the river, it was hidden from view, but once you got up above, you could basically see that there was an entrance on the side of the hill, and this was about 1,500 feet up the side of the hill, up the side of the up to one of the canyon walls. And there was a little ledge, and then there was about 30 steps that had come down to about the point where the river probably had gone by many millennium before, or however long. And so, and like 12 by 9 foot tunnel. All these tunnels I happen to see, and even the ones that run coast to coast now that all the fiber optics in, they're all 9 by 12. I wonder what Richard Hoagland would say about that. But anyway, so all these 9 by 12, so there's about a 9 by 12 tunnel, 9 high, 12, and it went down at an angle. And every so often there'd be a little branch, for like a warrior's quarters or a mess hall or some kind of other lavatory or some of the family quarters. And it kept going down and down into the side of the hill. And this is like a sandstone, limestone thing, so it's doable to carve it out. And like there was a big mess hall that was like 50 feet across by like 300 feet long, and had a big like mess table made of stone in the middle, and everything's made of stone. And so he got to the bottom. And there was like a temple set up, and this is in Arizona, in Grand Canyon, a temple set up, and 2 saguaro cactuses on either side, carved out of this white marble, and a Chinese-looking Buddha sitting in the lotus kneeled in the front. It was like this altar temple that had all these Chinese, and that's why you read in here that Asiatic people from the Mideast or something from the Orient. And so these basically was the hidden Grand Canyon thing from Asia. Supposedly some of these artifacts were published in National Geographic magazine in like 1913. This was 1909. They were said they came from Egypt, but really they had come from the Grand Canyon, and they were very Egyptian. And so the most unusual thing about this, everything's got something very unusual. And so the most unusual thing about this is that this thing was said to have held probably 40 or 50,000 people could live comfortably in this. Much not unlike the underground bases that the government builds that can have have all sorts of barber shops and auto repair shops, whole cities underground basically. And so another interesting story about this is it's not the Arapaho, it might be the Navajo that live in the area, have an ancient legend about the people with 2 hearts versus the people with an evil heart and a good heart versus the people with just a good heart. Like most people in this room are people with 1 heart, we're all good people. Well, there was this legend about I think it's the Navajo. Basically, there was a war between the people with 1 heart and the people with 2 hearts. And the people with 2 hearts had enslaved the people with 1 heart. And eventually, much like the Babylonian rebellion, eventually they broke free and they came from underground to found, I think it was the Navajo Nation. And this is their creation story of how, and they came from the Grand Canyon. They came from underground in the Grand Canyon to found a native nation. So that's a very interesting tie-in to something that basically, was published in 1909. And he talks about that in the story. You can just Google Grand Canyon, Smithsonian or something, and it talks all about the history of the whole thing in the article. So anyway, so there's a lot of these like weird canals. This is an image from Naples in Florida, where there's these large canals that are inland that are basically fed off of the ocean, but they're basically like small harbors. And what's so unusual about the ones in Naples is that there's a large, almost like a modern day flood control. And what's interesting is that in the center of it, much like we might have, there's an extra depression for the keel of a boat, apparently. And so this is obviously man-made. It's not like a natural irrigation ditch. This is a man-made structure that has basically been there since God knows how long. And once again, this was found in 1885. And so much like what I talked about before, this relic here was pumped up from a well from probably the 300 or 400 foot level up in Idaho, and it's known as the Nampa image because it was found in Nampa, Idaho, 1889. And so, that looks humanoid to me, and just the fact that it was pumped up, with gravel and stone from the bottom of a well makes me wonder what else is down there. Here's some other artifacts that were pumped from a well. A lot of coins, a lot of just weird stuff that comes up. And I like to look at this bird figure here, this flying feathered serpent with the guy on the back of it. Kind of reminds me of an ancient UFO. 1870, Illinois. Wow. Anybody ever heard of Bolsa Chica State Beach? Down in Huntington Beach in California? Well, the whole up and California, from about Los Angeles to San Diego, there used to be a culture that they called the Topanga culture. It's where Topanga Canyon, the famous UFO sightings of Topanga Canyon, come into play. What's interesting about this Topanga culture, nobody really knows anything about them. And in the Bolsa Chica State Beach, in fact, this was another condominium project that was going in, and they were doing some excavations, and next thing you know, they came across these things, and the developer was not happy. They did their, environmental impact studies, but these cogstones kept mystifying the scientists and the archaeologists involved, because this is a very simple one here, but some of them had conical holes drilled in the center of them, like they were used as a wheel or some cog form. Some of them had a conical hole drilled in it where it was narrow at both sides, and then as it got to the center, it got bigger, which we can hardly even duplicate today. It's much like some of the stuff in the museum, and we would have difficult duplicating it today. And so these are known as the cogstones of the Topanga culture. And what's so unusual about them is that, archaeology, just like many of our offices and our papers and stuff, archaeology goes by levels. As you go down in levels, you get older and older and older. And what's interesting about the cogstones is that they found a bunch of cogstones, and then at a lower level, they found a bunch of cogstones mixed with a bunch of instruments that might have been used by a caveman, 40,000 years ago or something like that. But then what's very interesting, this is what the archaeologists don't explain, is that below that level, they found another level with cogstones only again, where there was no flint, as though the culture that came in above it at a later date basically found a bunch of cogstones laying around and used them in their culture. It was deposited in their layer, and then another layer got deposited on top of it. And so the premise being that the cogstones themselves and the people that made them were much, much older, hundreds of thousands of years possibly, older than what the archaeologists give us credit for. Because of that, the archaeologists don't have an explanation for that lower layer. Anyway, we better hurry because I've got a lot of slides. Anyway, so this is an interesting one from just outside of Tucson. I forgot the name of the road, but the same thing. They were doing some road grading in the 1930s, I think it was, and the road came through, and they graded up the sides of the embankments, as the road grader came through, and then a few years went by, and the rains came down and eroded some of the road things. And this was on somebody's property who owned the property where the road went through, and he was out there, looking around, and he noticed one of these crosses sticking up out of the embankment. So he started digging around, and he ended up finding like 30 or 40 of them all together. They were all like lead crosses that had been riveted. And and a lot of these symbols, these are a couple of the symbols here, but a lot of the symbols had almost like a Minoan, a Greek, a Minoan, almost like a Roman characters to them. So the premise was that these were basically brought here by the Romans. And here are some, here are some other Roman drawings. But I want you to remember these because we'll talk about the beehives in a minute, and the beehives were found very close to where these are near Florence. So anyway, once again, there's a lot of evidence that there's a lot of diffusion of culture all over the world. There's a lot of different symbols that have been found here. There's been Egyptian symbols found in Australia. There's been all sorts of crazy, different symbols. And then there's like the elephant slabs. Elephants went extinct here about between 10 and 40,000 years ago. It's probably more than that. And yet there's a lot of depictions, typical native depictions depicting elephants. So the question is, how did they have knowledge of the cultures where elephants were from? Where was that knowledge brought from overseas, or were actually elephants or some kind of mammoth or something, alive up until most recently? Did anybody hear about the dwarfs off of California coast, on the islands off of California coast? What's interesting, I don't think I have a slide about elephants, but basically there used to be some pygmy elephants that lived on an island off of near Catalina. It's like North Catalina, one of the Channel Islands. And they found some skeletons. First they found, this is like 40, 50 years ago, they found skeletons of small elephants, like the size of a large dog almost, And then just more recently, like 6 years ago or something, they found actual skeletons of a small race of beings, humanoids, that were only like inches tall. And the theory being that they ate the elephants, and that's why the elephants went extinct. But at least that's the story as I heard it. So this is like a, this one's pretty standard. It's not that big of a deal. This one's a little more interesting. Out in Tennessee, Tennessee's a big farming country, especially back in the 1800s. And, what happens is farmers farm their field, and then what happens is that year after year, if they hit something in the field, a stump, a rock, a boulder, or whatever, they run and get the tractor and they dig it out. Because they don't want to keep, year after year, they don't want to bend up their farming equipment. And so that's what happened with this find, is that a farmer was out there and he hit something, he went and dug it up, and what he found was the top of like a 6 or 8 foot wall that ran for at least about 1,500 feet through his property. And this is about 8 feet underground, well, maybe not 8 feet, but the top of the wall was probably about 3 or 4 feet underground, and the bottom of the wall was probably 10 feet. And it had, and what was interesting about the wall is it had, amazing I can remember all this stuff, it had all these characters in this weird, almost like an alphabet. You can almost see the alphabet down there at the bottom. And it had all these weird characters, but then it was covered in a red cement, as though whoever wrote all the characters didn't want anybody to read it. And then so it was covered in this red cement, and then apparently like many, many years went by where 10 feet of topsoil covered it. You know that you're living in the city, it's a little bit higher, but living out in the country, topsoil accumulates, dust accumulates at 1 inch every 100 years. And so, in the city, of course, it's probably like 10 inches every 100 years, and that's why we got to all dust our houses so often. And that's basically just even from bombardment from space. They say that, we got enough like micro bombardment from space to basically make up the mass of the Earth, but then that gets into all hyperdimensional mumbo jumbo. So what's interesting about this Tennessee carving is that dang animal at the top right there looks like a kangaroo with big flat feet and a little beard. I've never seen an animal like that. Is this an animal from another planet? Is this an animal that used to exist here that there's no fossil record? What is it? And so I like to use the analogy of bananas. I think bananas in food. There's no other food like it. They're plantain. It's all very, very unusual food. And so, it could be that the Anunnaki or whoever, when they came in, they brought their own foodstuffs, and it could go with everything else. Cattle, the geese, the ducks, the eggs, all that. Everything on this planet could be imported. And that's why I recommend people to look at Lloyd Pye's great presentation on the cosmic dump trucks, as he calls them. Whereas basically there's an extinction level event that happens on Earth, and the call goes out, hey, Earth's been bombarded by some catastrophe, and they literally just come in with cosmic dump trucks and open them up into the oceans and just drop off a bunch of life and come back a few million years later and see what happened. But anyway, so that's the cosmic dump truck theory. Talk to Lloyd Pye about it. So there's a lot of like weird, this is like a modern day rendition that's next to this ancient depiction of a feathered serpent. That's what it looks like today. But this is what it looked like many, many years ago in the 1800s. And right next to this depiction, this is near Illinois, southern Illinois, near Cahokia. Well, it's actually Pisa. It's called the Pisa rock drawing. And so right next to this Pisa rock drawing are these stairs. Not these stairs here. This is just a Google image. But there's these stairs that run up, and they literally end nowhere. It's like the stairs to nowhere. I don't know if bridge to nowhere. There's several bridges to nowhere. I know they just built a bridge to nowhere up in Alaska for like $400 million and ends in the side of a mountain. And so, but there's all these stairs to nowhere. And so it's kind of interesting. It's kind of like the stairway to heaven. And why are we always trying to get back to heaven?
Because it's hell down here.
Well, or this is heaven on earth. And so there's also a lot of weird footprints that have been found solidified in like ancient stone. These ones here were found inside of a cave, and they may have been etched. But then, of course, the authorities chopped them out of the cave, and now, or they were on display in St. Louis, and now, almost 200 years later, they're probably long gone. And so this is an interesting one. While they were building the Nevada State Prison in Carson City, where inmates are probably staying right now who aren't able to watch the DVD, while they were building that prison, they came across this rendering of a footprint that was basically in rock that was 10 million years old. And so, how do you explain that? Here's another good example. This one was found in rock, fossilized rock, 300 million years old. And what's very interesting about these, what appear to be astronaut boot-like things, is that in the lower left at that bottom, I don't really have a laser pointer and it wouldn't come out very good, but in the lower left at the bottom thing, I think it's about right in this area, there's actually a trilobite. And a trilobite is interesting because, oh yeah, okay. Oh yeah, if you could handle.
I need to run your table. People are running amok.
Yeah, I know. I've lost a lot of stuff out there already. People are stealing books out there. So. Yeah. Yeah, it's I have a philosophy about stealing and losing stuff. I lost like $1,000 on equipment like in the last 3 weeks. But I figure if people want to steal it, they need a lot more than I do, because I surely don't need a lot of this stuff. But that's the way it is. So what's interesting is that that in the foot of this thing, when this thing was put down, there was a trilobite, and trilobites have been alive in the form that they found them in for like 300 million years. And so you have to ask yourself who was here and put down these footprints. Now here's another interesting one, the Caso geode. There's an X-ray of it. This was found in near China Lake, actually, in California. And the interesting thing about this one is that it appears to be a spark plug. And there's a lot of questions about whether this is a hoax or not, because it was be a spark plug that was used in mining equipment around the turn of the century, about 1900. And so, but what happened was that some rock hunters were out looking for geodes, and you know what a geode is? It cooled in a certain way inside the earth, and when it cooled, it crystallized on the inside in a certain way, but it still formed a ball. And so rock hunters find these, and they cut them open, and then they sell them for like the big bucks, And so that's what these guys were doing. And this is like 1952, 1953. And so they went to cut this thing open, and it ruined a brand new diamond saw blade trying to get the thing open. And when they opened it up, this is what they found. It was basically a little cylindrical ceramic, with a cylindrical metal pin going down the middle of it. And so there's been some theories lately that it may have been a hoax, because what had happened, it looked like a geode, but it wasn't a true geode, and it had some like 100 million year old fossils embedded in the outside as though it was really old. It wasn't an actual geode. And so if you Google the Caso geode, you'll see there's a lot of controversy over this one. And then there's also been some frogs that have been found in solid rock. There's been reports in England. This is Charles Fort. And Charles Fort started the Fortean Society, he called it. I'm not sure it was started by him, but it's actually still in existence. There's the International Fortean Research Organization, INFO it's called, and I think it's like info.org or something. And so the Forteans are big, and so one of the reports Charles Fort had was the report of a live frog that apparently had been embedded in solid stone, that somehow when the owner had cracked open the stone, this live frog jumped out, apparently in extended hibernation. Now you wouldn't think so much, just another hoax and this and that, until we come across this silver bell. And the silver bell was also found in Massachusetts, 1890s. And what happened here was that a pastor at a church decided he wanted to expand the worship hall. And there was a large pudding stone. I don't know what pudding stone is, but it's basically a large like flagstone in the back of the property. And they decided they're going to blow it out to build a foundation for their worship. And so at the 15-foot level, so they basically drilled a bunch of holes, blew in a bunch of dynamite, and when they blew it out, this is what basically fell out of the pile that was apparently embedded about 15 feet below the surface. And it's a very unusual bell. It's made out of silver, and the top there where it looks like it's inlaid is actually inlaid with mother of pearl. And so Very unusual find. Very unusual that actually photographs still exist of it, even considering you know, the suppression of everything else. And so this is another one that baffles me. Was there another civilization here before us, and we're just finding the ballpoint pins that just happened to not corrode by then? You know, or was this Atlantis? You know, or did another civilization, did the alien, you know, did the astronauts that brought the big footprints that we saw earlier, did they bring this kind of stuff? And how did it get 15 feet below the Earth? How did it get in what apparently is metamorphic rock that's been heated, you know, that's been sedimentary and then you know, heated by the Earth? You know, very bizarre. And so there's been a lot of these other weird mysteries. Here's what appears to be a artificial light bulb that was found in an Egyptian tomb. It's now in the Egyptian Museum. And there's replicas actually at Eric Van Daniken's Ancient Mysteries of the World. You know, Van Daniken's Ancient Mysteries of the World theme park in Switzerland. And so they have actually a working replica of what they call the Egyptian light bulb, I think it is. And of course, you know, there's all these ancient cultures also have a number of these effigies that they make of their leaders and of their priests and stuff. And so some of these effigies are very unusual looking. And here's one here that looks almost like Star Trek IX, you know, unusual, and in a way. And so and I have other pictures of those too. Some of the old Sumerian figurines that look almost reptilian, and I don't know if I have any of those in here later, but some of those are also very unusual. And so here's an interesting thing. I mean, it's obvious that somebody had communication with the old world, because when Chief Joseph, who wrote the famous poem about Seattle, died, when he died, in his medicine pouch, they found a cuneiform tablet that was dated to 2000 BC. And so obviously he hadn't been to, you know, Babylon, but obviously somewhere along the lines the native people had traded with somebody who had this culture here. Now whether this was found here originally or, you know, it was brought, you know, in the 1800s, who's to say? And so here's those beehives I was talking about. These are near Casa Grande, near the Arizona, Florence, the prison in Florence, Arizona, and everything's near a prison. Isn't that coincidental? Thank God for Wackenhut. And so the beehives are basically a very unusual thing. Nobody really knows the history of them. They're built out of local stone, and there's no glue and no cement, no nothing. They're all held together by gravity, much like the Integratrons held by gravity and glue. And you see the front of them here. On the back of each one, about halfway up, is like what appears to be a vent hole. And so the theory is that they were large kilns to smelt something. Nobody really knows what. I once again think these are possibly related to those crosses that we found earlier that are supposedly of Roman origin. And there's a very interesting story about the city of Phoenix, and that Phoenix is actually named not only for the flaming bird that returns to life, but for the Phoenicians. And that the Phoenicians in like 1500 BC had actually founded a city where present-day Phoenix is today. And that these are Phoenician smelters. And that the Phoenicians were there to smelt metals to take back to Phoenicia. And so, and of course, the climate was much different. Just like the climate in California was much different, like in Salton Sea, that whole area was just a big ocean at the time. Well, this whole area was also different. It wasn't quite as lush as some other areas, but still it was a habitable culture many thousands of years ago. And it's one of the reasons, like the Anasazi in New Mexico had to leave, because basically the climate had changed abruptly on them and they were without a home. So these are the beehives. You can actually, these are on private land, but you can still, with a four-wheel drive vehicle, you can get close enough to land to kind of see them. But very, very interesting thing. They've been all fenced off now, though. And so there's also a lot of unusual, like what appear to be natural stone formations. I'm not quite sure where this one is, and this actually, oh, you know, these might be this is probably in Oakland. There's a lot of old stone walls in Oakland that basically nobody really has an explanation for them. They think that the Indians used them as game traps, where they games into these walls, except then what happens is in some places the walls really aren't high enough to capture game. The game would just jump over them. And so nobody really knows, and they seem to be territory walls. These run through the Oakland Hills, up in Oakland, where all those fires were, up in the Oakland Hills, these walls, and they'll pick up, they'll run for half a mile, and then they'll stop, and then they'll pick up, as though it was like the Great Wall of China that ran through Berkeley or something. And they actually run up all the way up through Oakland. And there's been several other walls like this that have been found, these ones in West Virginia, that seem to create some kind of escarpment where to basically fend off a battle or something, between two creeks or whatever. And most of these are all attributed to, Native American cultures, the Mississippians, the Cahokians. Oh, and I forget there's a third group. And so, once again, we won't spend much time talking about the mounds and the mound builders. That's really for a different lecture. This is actually a depiction of Cahokia. And Cahokia Mound was the largest, basically, population center in both North and South America for many thousands of years, probably, maybe only a few hundred years. They estimate that the cities were 40, 50, 60,000 people. And what's interesting about Cahokia, and I don't know if I have a picture here of it or not. No, I don't, to save time. But Cahokia is the largest pyramid in this hemisphere. It's actually greater, the base of Cahokia is greater than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. The base of it is, but because it goes at a much shallower angle, it's actually less volume. But the base of it is actually larger than the Great Pyramid. And it's the largest earthen structure in the world, Cahokia Mounds in Illinois. And so, then also, like in New Hampshire, there's the Mystery Hill, where they think a lot of the Vikings landed and set up a community and basically built a bunch of stone fortresses and that kind of stuff. So this is like America's Stonehenge, they call it, Mystery Hill in New Hampshire. Oh boy, and then the Mima Mounds. These are up in Washington State, and very unusual. These go for hundreds of miles. And they seem to be very symmetrical. And what's unusual is when you go up to them, they're about 6 feet across and about 4 feet high. Those are two state roads there. And you go up to them. I haven't been there yet, but I'm planning this Mystery of America tour that I'm trying to organize for 10 years now. Most of all this research is all like 10 years old. Once again, that's why we're getting into time travel here soon. And actually the official lecture of this is Mystery of America - Time Travelers from Our Past. So it kind of covers all the bases. So anyway, the Mima Mounds, so they're like 6 feet across. And what's unusual about them is that there's like a bedpan of gravel, and then the mounds seem to be made of a different substance, like another size of gravel. And they're like a composite material, so there's different materials within them. And for years and years, they thought, they were Indian burial mounds. That's how they were classified, the Indian burial mounds. And then it turns out that, well, no, there's never anything found in them. And they seem to shift over time. New ones form and old ones, so they think it has something to do with the wind currents or whatever. And we'll get into that in a minute with some of the other rocks. Yeah, we'll talk about the rocks in a second. Ooh. So anyway, here's a runestone. This is kind of an interesting one because it was found in the roots of a 40-year-old oak tree. This is in Wisconsin, I think. No, Minnesota. A 40-year-old oak tree that had been ripped up by the initial frontier owner of the property. This is the first white man to settle the property. And a couple years after him settling the property, he ripped up the oak tree, found this in its roots. So it was obviously there before he settled the property. And it basically tells a story in Viking, in Ogham it's called, Celtic script, and we don't have a lot of time to talk about Celtic script, but what's interesting about a lot of the Celtic script that's been found that predates this stone is dated to 800 AD or something, but there's some stones that have been found thousands of years old, and what's interesting about the Ogham that's found, and the Ogham is spelled two ways, O-H-G-H-A-M, and without the second H. And one has vowels and one doesn't. very interesting is the ones that are found in the Americas have no vowels. And much like the ancient Hebrew, Hebrew used to be written without vowels. Languages used to have no vowels. So moon would be MN. Loop would be LP, loop, without the vowels. And so what's interesting about the Ogham that was found in the Americas, it lacks vowels. Whereas some of the oldest Ogham of the Celts and stuff that's been found in Ireland and Scotland, actually they all have vowels. As though the Vikings emigrated from the Americas, not the way around. So, figure that one out. And once again, a guy named Barry Fell, who wrote America BC, basically did a lot of the preliminary research on that one. So this is a Kensington runestone. It tells the story of about 14 Vikings who encountered some Indians or something, and they all got slaughtered. And the one guy that was left basically carved this stone, and that's kind of the story. Interesting thing, it's still on display. This is something you can actually go see in the museum in Kensington, Minnesota. This is where the official presentation ends with the mysterious, the what?
Moving rocks.
Yeah, the moving rocks in a place called Playa del Rey, or is that Burning Man? I'm going to Burning Man like in 3 weeks, so I gotta get things straight. But anyways, it's called I'm also used to these scientific names, but its common name is the Devil's Playground, and so we'll just call it by its common name now. And so this is out in Death Valley, California, and these rocks, amazing that they slide along the ground. And sometimes they don't just slide one way, they slide and they turn direction and they slide the other way, or they slide and they make a 90-degree turn, and nobody can tell what the heck's going on. Archaeologists go out there and what happens is that the rains come and then the ice forms and then the wind comes along and blows the rock around, and then the wind shifts and then it blows the other way. And it's because of the density of the rock and the ice, but then how does it make the groove? How does it resist the friction to make the grooves in the wet? And so nobody really knows. I've got a theory that that I've read in books, that there's basically a very large underground anomaly there. Has anybody heard of the zone of silence in Mexico? Only the hardcore people here. Anyway, there's this zone of silence. It's like south of Laredo or somewhere in Texas. Over the Texas border, and there's a zone of silence in Texas where no radio communication is possible. You can't receive FM or AM radio, you can't transmit radio, you can't do anything. And this has been, a problem for like the Mexican military. What if they, have some problem there? And the thought is, much like this place, and there's other places like this in the world too, where these rocks slide around. The theory being that there's some kind of large anomalous mass underground, whether it's a large piece of iron or quartz crystals or something large underground. And like with the zone of silence in Mexico, they think it's like a large piece of iron that basically grabs any radio wave you could possibly, So for, us mind control victims, it's a perfect place to go. It's a built-in Faraday cage every day. And so Playa del Rey, there's other places there's like one up in Montana and places, but this is the most well-known. And you basically just go there, and you can see where some people have come up and they've brought their own rock. They've got a rock from over there or something. They've gone down and plopped it down, and then you can see it just starts moving. It doesn't start right away. And other people think it deals with the rotation of the Earth and the way that certain cosmic rays and solar energy basically, and this is getting into hyperdimensional physics and stuff, but basically some people believe that it has to do with the spin of the Earth and the curvature of the Earth. Much like, remember the old Carlos Castaneda stories about how you're supposed to sleep with your head a certain way? Well, what's interesting about that story is when you go look in the old shamans and all the old stuff, by doing that, you're pointing your energies in a certain direction out in space. As the Earth's spinning. And so once again, getting back to sacred geometries and all this other stuff, there's certain applications for which way we sleep at night. If we sleep to the north or the south, Castaneda said we should sleep to the southeast because it brings wealth and health. And we all want health and wealth. And so, and then what was it? If you slept to the east, you'll be wealthy. If you slept to the south, you'll be healthy. If you slept to the west, you'll be well-worn. If you slept to the north, you head to the north, you may die. That was the old Yaqui poem that basically Castaneda had. Amazing, I remember. That's like 30 years ago. How could I remember that? Anyway, so these are the Playa del Rey in Nevada. Amazing place. If anybody heads out that way for Burning Man, for example, I highly recommend go see it. Unfortunately, you need like a four-wheel drive vehicle to get there, and it's kind of protected land. You can't just be burning around out there. They actually have rangers that go out there and investigate people. Okay, I don't think we should talk about that. Well, yeah, it's okay. Next time. And you know, for anybody who's interested, like right now you can go onto Google Video and type lostartsmedia.com, www.lostartsmedia.com, and watch like a bunch of videos that I produce for free for now until I do pay-per-view. I've done about 4,000 videos in 7 years. And so why I'm saying this is that I've developed a slideshow. This is about 150 slides out of about 4,000 slides that I have. So I'm going to do like, I'll probably get to about 100 slides in 2 hours. So 4,000 slides is going to, you know, 60, 80, 100 hours of DVD shooting. So if anybody's interested in all the other stuff I have, I call it Ted's Theory of Everything, the Grand Unified Conspiracy Theory. And basically what I've tried to do is, of all the stuff I've learned and heard about on the Art Bell Show, even though I don't ever listen to the Art Bell Show, but I know all the people that are on it. And I basically compiled it all into one theory that basically gets everything down to the least common denominator. And some of that we'll be talking about now with time travel and like, my latest thing is like interdimensional, not so much Hoagland physics, but particle physics. The Big Bang, the muons, gluons, squarks, morks, all that kind of stuff. I think that's really where the key is to understanding everything that we have. So anyway, just to wrap up the ancient mysteries part. So this is the Encheirothera mechanism that was found, and it's dated to a BC, and they think it was a solar astronomy kind of like a calculator to get transits of the thing that was used apparently in Greece in like 80 BC. And notice the detail of the gears involved there. And so when they found this, they actually was all encrusted in refuse and everything. And so they x-rayed it, and they couldn't believe it how exquisite the precision was. And at the time this was found, I think it was in the 1930s or 1940s, they didn't even think they could duplicate it at that point. We probably could today. These are interesting ones. These are found in Africa. These stones are said to be about 100 million years old. I forget what they're called. They've got some place name associated with them. But notice the three little green ring grooves around the center of them. And it's much like the bola stones that the Aborigines in Australia used to throw. And basically the thought is that those three lines were not only used to grab, to basically wrap around the string, but they also, much like the grooving in a bullet, also help aerodynamically to have the stone spin farther. You know, that's why you have the little dimples on your golf ball, because apparently dimples on a golf ball make a golf ball fly far. You know, it basically reduces the surface tension with the air. But anyway, so these are very interesting, and whenever they find these, they're always in layers that are like 50 to 100 million years. And yet the archaeologists say, oh, well, that's just a natural occurring, lines on there. Don't pay any attention to it. But they have been known to have been used by cultures, several thousand years ago. And then, of course, we get the Costa Rican stones. And these are also very unusual. Many thousands of these have been found in Costa Rica. Actually, smaller ones. The larger ones, there's only probably 20 or 30. And nobody really seems to know what make these like this. Or was God playing, a game of pool or something, or what was going on? And so, once again, just more ancient mysteries of the world. And of course, there's
very mathematically perfect.
Yeah, they're basically they're almost a perfect spear. And in fact, once again, it would be very difficult for us to duplicate this today. Mm-hmm. A hammer and a chisel wouldn't do it. We wouldn't get it so square. Maybe if it were a little smaller. So. Another buddy, Zacharias Sitchin, I traveled the world with him for a few years, going to all these ancient mystery places. He talks about Baalbek and Egypt, and in fact, we flew into Lebanon. We flew into Damascus like 4 days after Clinton bombed Afghanistan the first time, and we thought they were going to cancel the trip, but we got over there and everybody's, oh, Americans, we love Americans. And so then we basically took a bus ride into Syria, got stopped by the Lebanese police for taking photographs of a military base or something, I forget. But but yeah, and so Baalbek, amazing. You know, do I have a picture of Baalbek? Yeah. Oh. So Baalbek has the largest stones on Earth, 1,500 tons. Some say that even modern cranes, they might be able to lift them, but they'd have a problem moving them because of the weight associated with inertia. And so these stones were basically mined in a quarry, 1,500 tons, and then dragged somehow, or levitated or whatever, about 1.5 miles to the Baalbek site. And then were lowered in place, were dressed and lowered in place, and you can see them here in this picture. There's actually 3 of them in this picture. And they're all about 80 feet long, 15 feet on each side. And amazing. And so Zecharia Sitchin thinks that this was a large, basically, landing platform on Anunnaki to basically do their space travels to and from the so-called home planet. And of course, Zecharia always talks about us living on a portion of a planet, and that basically the planet we live on was cleaved off in an ancient cataclysm possibly 1 billion years ago. And that where the Pacific Ocean is was basically a scar of that collision, and leaving the asteroid belt in our wake. We in the orbit, and according to Boyd's law, there should be another planet where the asteroid belt is, but there's not. And there shouldn't be a planet here, but there is. And so the theory is there was a large collision that basically scraped off the asteroid belt and all the comets, because they're in that very highly elliptical orbit. And and this is another mystery that science can't answer, is why do the comets orbit the solar system in the opposite direction as everything else? And Sitchin says it's because this invading planet came from the other direction. And that's why when it cleaved off a quarter of Tiamat, it was called, and basically left everything out into space. But anyway, so if anybody's interested in Sitchin, Sitchin.com, goes on and on. Anyone know what this is? Maybe this helps. These are the grooves of phonograph. And you know, remember the old phonographs? Anybody remember the old phonographs? Like, that was like 50 years ago. Dang, I'm old. And so these are the grooves of a phonograph. And how a phonograph works is that there's a needle, there's a diamond stylus, and it reads these grooves. And so the depth, basically the depth of the groove is the loudness, how loud it gets. And the angle of the groove and the variation of the stylus picking it up is the frequency response. So for an example, this is a bad example, but a wider groove would have a lower bass response, and a narrower groove might have a higher frequency response. And so the idea being that this is how phonographs are made. So what's interesting, I don't know if anybody ever heard of this Matching Tie and Handkerchief album that the Monty Python had put out in the 1970s or late 1960s, but basically what they did is they did the same thing with a phonograph, but they started a separate groove around it. And so 99 times out of 100, most people are going to just start their phonograph groove, and it's going to just start from the beginning. But then every so often somebody might pick it up and hear the record in the middle, you know, they hear a song in the middle, and 50% of the time they would lay it down in another groove. And Monty Python didn't tell anybody about this. This was like a hidden little thing, and every so, you know, and then it spread word of mouth. This was before the internet. And so it spread word of mouth, and then it was like the big thing, and nobody could figure out why there was only like 23 minutes on a side, you know, it should be 43, and this is why. And so what's interesting, why I bring this up is the whole phonograph thing and the way that we were thinking also deals with a culture known as the Dropa. And it's unfortunate, when I was on National Geographic, we did a whole series on the Dropa that was in the cut right before they edited it, because I got the final cut before it got broadcast, and all the Dropa stuff was in there, but then in the final broadcast, yeah, they cut it out. So, but at least I got the copy that, you know, that was good. And also, if anybody's also interested, I also have a lecture that's 2 hours. It's basically the same lecture with all the stuff that I had to remove for this in it, and that's also like $5. You might as well just give them away. But anyway, so what's interesting about the Dropa is that they had these stones, these Dropa stones. And these were once again found in 1938. Oh, no, actually they were found in the 1910s, and then it took them 20 years Chinese scientists to try to decipher what was inside of these grooves. There were little writing. So there was these big phonographic-looking records. Here's the actual copies, phonographic-looking records, and there were all these like phonographic grooves that ran around them, and there was a little writing on the inside of it. And what was interesting about the writing, it took them 20 years, the scientists working on it, to try to figure out what it said. And when he figured out what it said, oh, here's the story right here. When he figured out what it said, it basically told of a story of an ancient race that had come from the heavens and had crash landed in what today is Tibet. And in doing so, they had basically crash landed and they couldn't get back to their home planet. They were stranded here. And so the theory going, they wrote down their history and whatever. And the idea being that these Dropa that and these were like the Dead Sea Scrolls. These discs were found up in a cave up in China. But apparently the Dropa were the descendants or were the ancestors of the Chinese. And so you ask yourself, why are there 1.3 billion Chinese on Earth? Because they were here first. And so the Chinese, may have been the first extraterrestrial visitors on Earth. And it makes sense because, they were here first. And so this is the Dropa story. So anybody interested, the Dropas, and it's a very fascinating story. And that's actually the mountainside where they were found. Okay, so there's also a Great White Pyramid that was found. It was spotted during World War II. Some pilots basically spotted this pyramid that was supposedly 10 times the size of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. And it was in some valley in Tibet. And apparently there was white-sided with white limestone or something on the sides. So anyway, I have to cover in all that. So normally this is where I'd stop, but we're going to get into timelines here. And so I threw this in because I like the way it's spiraling, how time is always like a spiral. It spirals out of the spirals. And so, and everybody's always got these spiral kind of things whenever they deal with the time. And so, yeah, it gets kind of crazy. Does anyone have the time?
No, but it's hot in here.
Yeah, is that back door open there?
It's 20 past 4.
20 past 4, and I've got till 5, supposedly, but then I got other stuff going on at 5. So let's talk a little bit about ETs.
Yeah.
Of course, you all know about Roswell. We're here at the 60th annual Roswell crash, the anniversary of the crash. And there's this other guy, Philip J. Corso. And of course, he died back in 97, 98, and his son still goes out and lectures now. But basically his premise, as it mentioned here, is that basically most of modern day technology, lasers, fiber optics, computer chips, silicone, all that stuff was seeded from the Roswell crashes, the Roswell, Socorro, White Sands crashes. There's supposedly 4 different crashes in New Mexico at that time. And what's interesting though, about 2 of those crashes, and this is what Corso writes in his book. I highly recommend everybody get The Day After Roswell. Actually, he doesn't write this in his book, but this is part of his story. And you can see I've put a couple X's and an O here on the map. And the theory being that there were 2 crashes in 1947 that were of particular interest, and that was the one in Socorro and the one here in Roswell. And notice the 0 in the picture is where the White Sands missile base is. Many of us may have driven here to get here. Near Alamogordo, which is where we tested the first nuclear bomb, the Trinity test site. And so basically the premise was, according to Corso, is that there were aliens and there were extraterrestrial craft monitoring our progress of our nuclear detonation of the first nuclear bomb detonated at the Trinity site. And this is the one where the green glass was fused. Did anybody hear about the green glass formed at the bottom when they were done detonating the nuclear blast? And a lot of you know that like 60% of the scientists that were involved in the Manhattan Project before they blew it off, 60% of the scientists, over half, thought that the nuclear reaction would get into the nitrogen in the atmosphere and basically cause a chain reaction and basically destroy the Earth. But they did it anyway because we were fighting the Germans. So, you know.
Thing is, though, they also possible prior nuclear weapons used in history?
Sure. Yeah, like Sodom and Gomorrah
India,
and Sitchin talks a lot about
glass.
the glass, but also like the darkening of certain areas, especially like in the Sinai Peninsula and stuff. But yeah, and so it's interesting because for a couple hundred years of archaeologists, they kept finding these green layers of glass, like at the bottom of, I don't think it was at Jericho or Samora or whatever, but in certain archaeological sites, especially like in Iraq, they were finding a green layer of glass at the bottom of their excavation, and they couldn't figure out what it was until July of 1947, when they detonated the first nuclear bomb, and the heat and energy from that bomb fused the quartz sand that was in the desert into a layer of green glass. So the theory being that there was ancient nuclear explosions that happened many thousands of years ago that could have possibly leveled biblical cities like they talk about in the Bible, where there's been green glass found. So it's another interesting little thing. So anyway, gotta go. So basically the premise is that there were aliens in their craft observing our nuclear tests in July of 1945, and when we detonated that first nuclear bomb, the electromagnetic pulse or some other kind of energy with that blast basically supposedly knocked the navigational systems of the two craft you see with the X's in July of 1945, knocked those out of the sky. But because the aliens were on a different timeline than we are, in our timeline, it took them from July 1945 to July 4th, 1947 to actually hit the ground. Now, granted, this is interdimensional in nature, so you wouldn't actually see it like slowly. It would like blink out of an existence and then hit the ground in a flash. You wouldn't even see it. But in their reality, in their timeline, it might have only been 5 or 10 seconds of them actually, by the time they were disabled, by the time they hit the ground. And so the premise being that these aliens that were observing our nuclear tests, if this is true, if what Corso says is true about time-traveling aliens, we're able to manipulate, we're able to dilate time, speed it up, slow it down. You're on one time, I'm it's all that whole paradox thing. And so that's really the mind blower of everything that Corso said and everything he talked about, the technology and stuff. It's really this idea of the aliens taking 2 years to crash. That's a mind blower. And so this is where like my current research has kind of led me, and we won't be able to get into the particle physics ends of it, because I really think time travel and a lot of like what we don't know about gravity. Gravity is a very unusual force. Get time, we'll talk about it, how weak it is. We can jump and happened before time. That first 10 minus to 32nd, seconds before the Big Bang, they've got everything down to the first 10 to the minus 43rd power after the Big Bang, but they don't know what happened like in the instant before that. Basically the whole entire universe was like clumped down into, my matchbook. But anyway, so time dilation, a very, very like intriguing subject to me. And I like using the example of the little fly. There's been a lot of little flies flying around here. And our eyes have a refresh rate of 16 frames a second, 16 to 18 frames a second. So that's why when we look at a 24p, a 24 frames per second motion picture, it looks like it's moving to us because our eyes don't refresh that rate. The refresh monitor is about 60 or 70 cycles. And so what happens, but the refresh rate of a fly, because of its genetics, is 120 times a second, 120 frames a second. So if a fly looks at a motion picture, it looks like a slideshow. A slide goes up for a few seconds, a slide goes up for a few seconds. And that's why when you go to swat a fly, it sees you coming from a mile away because it's refreshing so fast. It's saying, oh, let's see, there's a threat. It's coming a little faster. It's coming a little faster. I better get out of here. Let me, bring my wings up to speed, and then off it goes. That's why you got to kind of disturb it with one hand and then grab it with the other. Their brains, are very good at like escaping, but they're not very good at like, watching. So, but luckily there's not many flies where I live. So this is the analogy I like to use concerning the Corso's time-traveling aliens versus the fly, because our refresh is so low, and I like it. And Zachariah Sitchin pretty good friends with him still. He's getting up there. But he likes to use the analogy of a fly. And he would talk about the Anunnaki and the immortals and the flies and everything, and how this fly that lives in my apartment basically would tell its grandkids, oh, that Ted St. Rain, he's so immortal, he's been here forever, for as long as our ancestors could talk about, he's been the god of everything. And that's only because their lifespan's 2 days. So we're to the fly, we are immortal, much like how God is immortal to us. He might live 100,000 years, but we're like, living 2 days, so, he's immortal. Kind of the history of the fly. And so I like to use this analogy that the refresh rate in our eyes are like the aliens, and the refresh rate on the fly's eyes are like us in 1947, where things are going our time is traveling through much faster. Granted, you don't want to travel fast. If you could, you'd want to slow time down, so you can enjoy it. But so anyway, so that's kind of the gist of what the most important part of what Corso had to say about the whole alien things and the technology is that this whole idea of time dilation and time travel. And now we all know that, if you have enough mass, you can distort like light. Einstein came up with this theory, and they tested it, and the theory did what they saw, and so they said, hey, that's great. So what happens is that when there's a star behind the sun, its light curves around the sun from the gravity of the sun. And now light is massless. A photon of light is practically massless, and yet still the gravity has an effect on it, and it basically warps it around the sun, much like this, the yellow line here on the left. And so the idea being that if you could get enough mass concentrated into a matchbook, you could distort not only light and space, but also time. And so this is where we get into this theory about wormholes. Like if you take a piece of paper, and the idea, and some are like, not the Betty and Barney Hill story, but some of the abductee stories talk about this, where supposedly how these craft fly interdimensionally. Once they're here, they have a certain propulsion system, but how they get from system to system is they basically tune in. Let's say there's Alpha Centauri, 4 light years away. They tune in to the frequency of that system. That system has its own particular frequency and its mass that has some numerical association with it. And they were able to create like a similar mass here that resonates at that same frequency. And if you create a big enough mass at a small enough place, the theory being that just like the page of a paper, you could pull the paper across, and then you don't have to fly like 5 feet to get to the next planet, instead of having to travel 6 light years. And so the theory being that you basically, if you can create enough mass, and according to some of the abductees, if you know the frequency, the resonant frequency of the place you're going, you can basically just tune it in like on a tricorder, hit a few buttons, and you're warped across there. It's not really like warping space. It's almost, and it's not really like a wormhole that's depicted here, but it's basically, and all you're really doing is you're pulling a piece of the space from Alpha Centauri. You're reaching out and you're pulling a piece of space from there, and you're pulling it right next to you, and then you just jump across it, and then you let go, and you're 4 light years away. So that's supposedly how some of these craft travel interdimensionally. The motherships, they basically just grab a piece of space somewhere and pull it next to them, and then they just step over there, and that's all that matters. Of course, you probably won't hear that on the Art Bell show. So anyway, but maybe you already have. So this is the premise that basically gravity can do a lot of different things. And once again, gravity is a very unusual thing. Nobody seems to know what gravity is. Scientists have been exploring it for hundreds of years, and they just don't know. And I like to use like the theory of the string theory. And everybody knows string theory, it's like the big thing in supersymmetry mumbo jumbo lately. But what's interesting about gravity is gravity has a certain kind of string attached to it. And it's a string, if I get this correct, it's actually a circular string. Whereas matter, 3D matter, everything that we know of, actually has more of a U-shaped string to it. And so the U-shaped string is actually attached to this reality. And that's why everything we have that we know about is physical. It's attached to this reality very solidly. And that's why you can't pull apart the strong force and the weak force of these atoms. You can't pull them apart. But gravity, on the other hand, has a different kind of string. And so the theory about gravity, one of the theories about string theory and gravity, once again, the reason that string theory was created in the first place was that standard quantum physics didn't explain everything. So they had to create a new theory that would encompass. One of them is gravity. Now, quantum physics can't really explain gravity, what gravity is. And so I like to use the example, and once again, according to the string theory, gravity is actually leaking. The force that is gravity, the full force that's gravity, 90% of it is leaking because of the ways that the strings are formed in it. It's leaking apparently into another dimension. And the reason that we can jump and break gravity because most of gravity's forces is being drained off somewhere else. Now, Hoagland, many, many years ago on one of these shows somewhere, was talking about the nature of the planetary systems itself and gravity itself. And one of the theories, I don't know if anybody heard about the ever-expanding Earth theory, about how 1 billion years ago the Earth was only a quarter of the size it is now. And to explain for tectonic plate movements and all that, really what's happening, the tectonic plates aren't moving around. The Earth has 4 times in size, and it continues to expand. And because the Earth is, what's happening is at the center of the Earth, the center of the Sun, the center of Mars, the center of Venus, this whole system that's based on Bode's law, you know, there's a certain fractal geometry with the way that the solar system, getting way ahead of myself, I'll talk about all this later, but anyway, so the idea being that that the supersymmetry, these strings in the gravity is just a very unusual kind of thing. And so let's get back to this for now. Okay, so there's this theory that there's these divergent timelines, and that we're on a timeline, we're going along, you know, but if we make a decision, if I decide to put this mouse over there and it screws everything up, then you know, I've made that decision. Thank God. Well, this is actually Keynote, thank God. If it were PowerPoint, I'd be out of there. But luckily Keynote knew what I wanted and it just recovered. So thank God for Macintosh. And so so the theory being, we're going along on a timeline, and every time we make a decision, that timeline changes for us. We spend $1,000, it changes for us. So the theory being that what happened on the original timeline, the timeline you see, actually it should be running down the middle, but that's the original timeline. And then on the real timeline, Nazis won World War II. And what happened supposedly, just like in Mad Max, you know, or Terminator or whatever, the people from the future, like in 2034 or something, I forget, there's a story about this, but the future, you know, it's like the Montauk Project kind of thing, whatever. And so the people from 2034 basically sent travelers back to before World War II and changed the history. Once again, you get into this whole thing about killing your grandfather and stuff like that, paradoxes and stuff. But they basically changed World War II in such a way, gave us the bomb or whatever, that we won World War II. So now there's 2 timelines. There's the one that the Nazis won and the one that we won. And we're going along and everything's happy in the 1950s, and we got the, you know, and the Cold War and everybody, the baby boom and all this and that. But then what might have started happening is that so these Nazification, I call it the Nazification, the Nazis, the Nazification people, might have gone back in time and started Nazifying all of the timelines that had been pure. And so, and I have a feeling, if this is true, once again, this is all just theory of Ted right here, you know, but if this concept is true, is of divergent timelines, basically that's what's happening to us today, is that for a long, long time we were on, you know, so-called democracy. It really should be a republic, of course. That's a whole nother lecture. But but you know, we're going along on a democracy, and all of a sudden it seems like we're in a, you know, almost in like a Nazi Germany. And it may not be by accident, because maybe finally the time police, the time Nazis, yeah, the time Nazis, timenazis.com, I'll have to register that soon. You know, I have like 100 websites. Every time I'm like, find a website I like, oh yeah, I got to do that. So like soytruth.com is one of them, thingspeopleshouldknow.com, you know, just anytime I come up with some crazy idea. So But yeah, so this will all be in the screenplay. You can all watch it at Blockbuster. So now we get into the Philadelphia experiment. Yeah, I thought you'd like that. I made that myself. I hope I don't get sued. So once again, you see here on this diagram where there was Project Rainbow, and there was 2 or 3 Project Rainbows, and one of them was dealing with the invisibility Philadelphia experiment. Everybody heard of the Philadelphia experiment or saw the movie or something? I get into it a lot with whole Carlos Jessup. Anyone heard of that name? He was like one of the original. Leda wrote to Jessup, Morris Jessup, Morris K. Jessup. Yes. If anybody wants to know about the
He
Hill,
also made notations in a book
that ended up back at the Navy, and then
handwritings, different colored inks, and the Navy was wondering.
Yeah, what this was all about. Do you know anything about this? The audience member was just talking about how Morris K. Jessup, basically, he was originally contacted by Carlos Alende. Yeah, anyway. So it basically, yeah, let's move on. Forget about it. So anyway, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, or as I like to call it, mumbo jumbo. So anyway, so the theory being that they were, in 1943, they were working on an invisibility project, also known as the Philadelphia experiment in the Philadelphia shipyards, and that they basically sent a battleship up the coast, and it reappeared up the coast in, I forget where, or maybe it reappeared in Philadelphia. And then you get the Montauk Project, and the Montauk Project is supposedly the other end of the Philadelphia experiment that happened in the 1960s and into the 1970s, where supposedly some of the members that were on the ship of the Philadelphia experiment during the experiment showed up in Montauk in the late 1960s. And there's also another interesting thing, if anybody's doing an internet search, there's a place called Ong's Hat, O-N-G-S, Hat, H-A-T, also up in New England. And there was a lot of very interesting experiments, mostly like with hallucinogenic drugs and things like that, where a community of people were all involved with like these very esoteric subjects, and supposedly they were using these drugs to time travel. I don't know if anybody's heard of ayahuasca from South America, Central America, where basically these Indians, they ingest this plant, this bark plant, and they all see the same entities. And they might have, and they all have the same experience, as though they're tuning, and what the drug thing about the whole 60s was about. It was basically raising enhancing our awareness. And so it's interesting that some of these ayahuasca experiences, basically they all see the same entities in a way. And so that's basically the history of the Montauk versus Philadelphia experiment. And so here's that Bode's Law thing about where, well, we won't get into this. This basically deals with the orbits of the electrons and the galaxies and things. And most of you are into all C. Steve Bassett, so you're probably pretty familiar with all that stuff. So, yeah, I just don't know if we have any time. Let's go forward a little bit on this. Okay, so these are examples of what I was talking about, strings. And the best way to, the best analogy that I can give to a string is like a tightrope. Like a flea walking on a tightrope. And you got to, and you know, a rope has a three-dimensional aspect to it, and it's round. But to a flea walking on a tightrope, it would be a flat plane. In any direction that he went, he would basically be like us walking on the globe. And so basically strings work the same way in that they interact with the reality in such a way that it's almost like us being the flea on the side of the rope. We can't quite comprehend what the whole rope is about, but we know that we're on some kind of plane. And this also gets into the different dimensions. You know, we all have heard about we live in a three-dimensional world with a fourth dimension is time, you know. And this is what really confused me in the whole particle physics aspect, is that fourth dimension of time really isn't fourth dimensional. You have three-dimensional, and then what you have would basically be a sacred geometry octagonal shape that would basically be a triangle in the fourth dimension. So it's a very hard kind of concept to grasp, but it's basically... Anyway, so... yeah, you know, I should probably wrap it up. Does anyone have a time here?
15 till.
Okay, and yeah, because I got to be other places. You know, I'm filming this whole event, and so I think we should be wrapping up. Does that counter back there have a time? On the
47.
So I'll just flip through these and see if there's anything interesting to talk about. Yeah, I know, but I only got so much time. And so here's the example I used about basically warping time with the... anybody heard of John Titor and the supposed time traveler in the stock market, which apparently was in the World Weekly News, so I wouldn't give it too much credence. But there was also, oh wait, let's see, no, this is the other one. This is the Titor that was on the Art Bell show. Ah, okay. Yeah, this is the Titor that was on the Art Bell show that supposedly had an old IBM machine that he was using as a time travel device. And it went on for like a few months. Art would have him on every other day or something, and then nobody's heard from him anymore. He went back to the future.
By the way, Art Bell is retired.
Oh, he did?
Yeah.
Oh, that's terrible.
For the fourth time.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Officially?
Yeah, yeah. No,
All
he
four
wants to go
times
live
are
in
official.
the Philippines.
So yeah, once again, we should probably just wrap it up because this is all about particle physics and crazy stuff. Oh, look at the string theory. Oh. So here are the 6 different strings that they think all matter is made up of, and I don't know which is which, but they're well, there's another one, and actually they keep finding more as they build larger and larger colliders. They can create heavier and heavier elements that have never existed before. And actually, they've predicted, they've been very good at predicting elements that they may find. So, and any other questions?
So what are we doing here?
Oh, watch the National Geographic
I
special.
thought you were going to get it all together in one statement.
Oh, wow, that's a good one. That is a good one. One statement.
What's your mass big theory?
Well, my mass big theory is that they're trying to kill us all off, and then in 50, 100 years, and actually that gets into the aliens, and that gets into this is a mind blower. We dropped the bombs in Japan in 1945, and within 2 years, supposedly 70 or 80 different species of aliens had come here, warning us, you have no idea what you're messing with when you detonate nuclear bombs, that you're having an implication in other parts of the universe and in other dimensions and in other times. And one of the concerns they had with that was the destruction of the human soul. And the only thing that can destroy a soul, apparently, according to these aliens, 60 or 70 different species, is being caught in a nuclear blast. And that the reason that all these aliens showed up here after because by setting off those nuclear bombs, we basically sent out a message to the universe, electromagnetic pulse, hey, here we are. And not only that, but this electromagnetic pulse, this technology, the splitting of the atom, probably permeated through space and time and other dimensions. It's not just in our third dimensional reality, but literally in other dimensions. And this is one of my theories about the crop circles, is that the crop circles are laid down as time markers for time missions that, let's say, the military-industrial complex is trying to send off on a time mission. So they'll lay down a crop circle because they know that on July 4th, 2007, that only this crop circle will be made. And basically the premise is that the aliens came here to tell us that we had no idea what we were with, and insisting us to disarm. And none of the alien species that would come here, of course, would really threaten us or anything. And the big premise was that that no, we're the strong. We just beat the war. We just beat Germany. We're the strongest thing on earth. We're not disarming. We're going to keep our nuclear weapons. And this is when all the UFOs are flying over and disarming the nuclear bombs one by one. And so, what's interesting is this thing called the Prime Directive that you hear so much about. And this kind of gets into the whole ET hypotheses and alien harvest and a lot of these other theories that everybody's heard over the years. And it's that there may be some kind of prime directive that we're property. And this is one of the big things, like Linda Moulton Howe used to talk about this a little bit, that we are property. Us, everything on this planet, everything in this, not in this galaxy, but everything in this quadrant of the galaxy is owned by somebody. And I believe there's actually a world king. It's above the Bushes and the families and the Illuminati and the Bilderbergers and the CFR and blah, blah, blah. There's really a world king that runs the world. Now, whether he lives here or not, I don't know. And ask Zechariah, when are the Anunnaki coming back? And his standard response is, did they ever leave? Are they not here now? The idea being that these 70 or 80 different species were coming to us, telling us, you have no idea what you're messing with, you have to disarm, get rid of nuclear bombs, live peacefully with one another. And we'd say, no, we're not going to do that, but we want your technology. We want a flying saucer. We want you to help us build weapons so we can destroy each other and, go into space. And another theory, I don't know if anybody's heard of this theory, that the asteroid belt is not the asteroid belt, it's the quarantine belt. That it is a quarantine for us on this planet, so that if we try to decide to, and the Van Allen radiation, but there's all sorts of problems out there.
The question of why haven't we returned to the moon in 30 years?
Well, that we can't. Yeah.
There was that somebody was there and they warned us all.
Well, and that's the premise that like Hoagland talks about on Mars, is that and we actually talk about this in like 4 slides if I have enough time. But we got another lecture coming up here. See, they should put me at the end of the day. So anyway, so prime directive, very interesting concept. Is there a prime directive in the galaxy? Because that's what these aliens were telling us, is that we're coming here for your own good. We want you to disarm. We're not going to give you technology, because it would be like us giving a Beretta knife to a monkey, and eventually it would find a way to stab people, or a machine gun, to a monkey, and eventually find the trigger. And it'd just be very irresponsible of the aliens to give us anything, except maybe some LSD and magic mushrooms and stuff. Which I believe the whole 60s thing, that whole awareness thing, the whole CIA propaganda, Bob Weir being on the CIA payroll, all that stuff, basically, was the same thing that's happening now with disclosure. They have to prepare us for the next steps, so that we can handle this thing so we can move on. And 9/11, I think 9/11 was great, believe it or not. I think 9/11 is just what we needed, and I think there'll be more 9/11. Because I think what's happening is there's something really big coming. Whether it's a Hoagland big and a cataclysm with another planet, or some there's something really big coming. And we need the little small steps. We need the 9/11s, oh my gosh, to basically prepare ourselves mentally for what, may happen in 2012. So anyway, so there may be this prime directive, and the aliens came here, they wouldn't give us the technology, but then we come across the Greys. And let me finish with the soul first. Oh, the soul, I love the soul. And so I think there's a soul collector, much like in Space Odyssey 2001, how there was the big monolith on the backside of Jupiter, and if you approach it the right way, you got shot to the other side of your soul. Got shot to the other side, much like the Great Pyramid is lined up in a certain way to astral, your soul. So I think there's a soul collector, and that like on your deathbed, that there are literally like a vortex opens up, swallows up your soul and takes it to another dimension or wherever. And this is why we have problems like serial killers and all of this stuff, because there's all this weird energy, and these portals basically can be manipulated. And the U.S. government, I don't know if anybody knows this, it's a theory that it's not a theory, but I'll have to research to find exactly where. But apparently the US government has developed technology to hold a soul in a container. Okay? But what they need is bodies. They need bodies to be able to implant the soul. And this is current tech. Supposedly this is what the US government's spending your drug money on, really. It's not, I can't say tax dollars because it's all paid for with drug money, which, it's okay. I can understand their deal. Got to enslave us. So, but anyway, so the premise being that there's a soul collector, and that basically what happened is that the government is now able to steal souls from people, but they need bodies. They're doing research, and they need bodies to put these souls in. And so how they get those bodies is by natural disasters. And so one of the theories, this is not any theory you'll hear out on the internet. This is like Ted's little grand unified conspiracy theory. Attacks like 9/11, especially the ones orchestrated like 9/11, were basically a method to possibly get bodies to implant souls in. So they're basically soul collectors. And a lot of this, this is really weird stuff. And you know about the research that was done, the random number generator research that was done before 9/11? There's right now, as we speak, there's like hundreds of random number generators just spitting out 1, 5, 7, 3, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All over the world, there's just all these random number generators spitting out stuff. Well, what was it? 70 minutes, I think, before 9/11, all of a sudden the random number generators started spitting out like similar numbers. And they have a big plot and a graph, and I talk about this in another lecture, but basically started spitting out a lot of different numbers that correlated to one another, as though there was some kind of rift in space and time or something that was making the randomness of the generators like hiccup. And all of a sudden, and you look at it, it's amazing. I don't have the graph in here, but amazing. You look at the graph, look for a 9/11 random number generator experiment or something. And it was like at Harvard or something where they were compiling the data. And you look at it, it's like, 910, 98, 99, 910, 911, 850, bam! The thing spikes like the randomness of the random number generator, like we're no longer random. Very unusual, and this predated the crashing of the things. And so there's very unusual stuff going on out there.
You know what the numbers were?
Once again, they're just all random numbers. It's like from 1 to 10,000, a machine will just spit out 6,045, 6,060, it just spits out a bunch of numbers. And normally they're all random. It's like you pick a number, pick a card, and they'll all be random. And it's a 50-50 chance of picking one or two. Well, what happened is all the numbers they started to manifest with one another in such a point that it was off the charts. So amazing research.
Who put the machines around and why?
It's a college. It's like I think it's either Harvard or Princeton or one of these places. But it's a mathematical. It's mathematics. It's all it's a mathematics department, and they're doing random number generators. And I can't remember what's his name back there. Greg. Yeah, Greg. How much time is on there?
An hour 44.
Okay, so we got to finish about 5 minutes, otherwise the DVD won't reproduce. So there's the monolith. And so it's interesting that it's just very interesting. So getting back to the prime directive, so this is the slide that talks about are the terror deaths related to the government's research souls. And granted, all operations have multiple purposes. Like cell phone towers, they do cell phones, but they also are great entrainment devices. And so, okay, so let's just go back and finish the soul collector story. And so what happened, and I might have more slides about it. What happened was that these 70 or 80 species of aliens had come here and telling us, we had no idea what we're messing with. And then all of a sudden, here along comes the Greys. And you probably all heard this story on Coast to Coast. So along comes the Greys, and apparently they had destroyed their planet like we're destroying our planet. And they had stripped off their atmosphere, much like the Anunnaki supposedly stripped off their atmosphere. They were coming here for the gold to float in their atmosphere. And so these Greys, they stripped off their atmosphere, and also they were experimenting with nuclear power like we were in nuclear wars, and they had damaged their genetics where they could no longer reproduce sexually anymore. They had to clone themselves. And so as many people know about tissue culturing and cloning, that as you get successive generations down the clone line, basically the DNA becomes worthless. You start introducing so many mutations that you can't even reproduce asexually anymore by cloning. And so this is what Greys had a problem. They lost their planet to a nuclear holocaust. They damaged their genetics. They had this technology, they could traverse the universe, but they didn't have a planet. And because of the way the prime directives set up, like all the planets are owned. You know, you got to go, you know, you can't just go and hop on a planet. And this was the big problem. Supposedly when the Greys landed here, you know, the aliens, these 70 different species, the reason we didn't want to give up our nuclear bombs because we felt they were the only chance we had against them. Yeah, little at that, but that the fact that we were afraid of, did anyone see the movie Arrival? Where the aliens come down and they set up these big heater plants. They look like electricity things from the outside, but really all they're doing is they're terraforming the environment because the aliens came from a planet that's 10 degrees warmer than this planet. So they're going to just warm everything up and kill us all off, take over the planet. So this is what, in the 1950s, this is what Rand and all these think tanks were worried about. And so I like to use that analogy of Arrival because it's very interesting, some of the developments concerning germ warfare after the 1940s. You know, the Germans were all way ahead on all this stuff. You know, synthetic motor oils, everything we have, it basically came from Nazi Germany, you know, for the most part. And all the chemical, you know, everything we have. And even thank God for the pesticides that poison us all. And so anyway, so the aliens are here. Where was I? I forgot totally now. Yeah, so they're terraform. They were going to terraform. They're thinking of terraforming the planet. And so what happened is the Greys got here, supposedly, and they didn't have a planet, and they didn't have a prime directive. They were like in survival mode. They had like 1,000 years left of cloning, and they were a dead race. And so when we said to them, we won't disarm, but we want your technology, they said, well, let's talk. You know, you got something we need. You got genetics. You got DNA that we could use to make a hybrid alien race. And then, you know, you've set us up for a while, and we'll live in these little underground tunnels, and we won't be too much bother. And then once we're established, we'll go and live somewhere else. If this is true, where I think they went was to Mars. I think the Greys came here and they said, hey, you know, U.S. government, you know, Truman, Eisenhower, you know, you got this planet over here, Mars, you're not really using it right now. You know, we'd like to work with you, and maybe, you know, we'll set up shop and then we'll just go live on Mars. You'll never hear from us again, you know, and we'll give you some technology. So this might be a possibility. If you know, talk to Hoagland, you know, he might agree that something weird is going on Mars, and they aren't telling us what any of that is. So, oh, look at that alien. Oh. And so, well, we better finish the prime directive. So before we get into the matrix and the hive. And so the prime directive was basically, and let me know when that timer gets down to like 152 or 153. And so basically the premise was the Greys were the only ones that would work out of the 70 or 80 different species. They were the only ones that needed something from us. But the problem was that the Greys didn't really want to give us technology we needed to defend ourselves from them. They would give us fiber, you know, they'd give us little bits and pieces of how to do anti-gravity, but they'd never really give us the keys to the kingdom that we needed to become a threat to them. And so supposedly this was all like, this all came to a head in the late 1970s in a place called Dulce, New Mexico, not far from here. And supposedly there was a war, the Dulce War they're called. And what happened, it was, you know, it was alien maser guns and our special forces and our M16s, and you know, of course we lost. And then the government was like, oh wow, we got a problem. Now we got hostile aliens. We brought them in. We've got hostile aliens. What are we going to do about it? But in the meantime, these 70 or 80 different species that had come here after World War II had continued to visit us from time to time. You see them in the skies every so often. These days, I think 90 to 95% of everything seen in the sky today is man-made. The other 5% are here with our blessings. The other 5% are probably just couldn't cloak fast enough to get rid of it, or whatever. And like the large things you've seen, that large wispy-looking thing that's on the Art Bell site, they've just forgot the name of it. Not the Serpo, it's all the sightings they were having in California, and then the one guy who used to work at Lockheed came back with the thing. Supposedly that was also the reason that those pictures were even taken in the first place, because normally it is cloaked. And the guy that worked at Lockheed was working on the cloaking part of it and the language part of the whatever. And so there's a lot of weird technology. Anyway, so the prime directive. So basically what happened is supposedly the Greys made a deal with us. They broke the agreement, but there's nothing we could do about it because we couldn't defend ourselves. Then what happened is these 7 or 8 different species continued to come back to us. And we said, hey, look, and the thing with the prime directive is that it's like it's a known hand a knife to a monkey, but if the monkey knows what it's getting into, if Truman signs off and becomes cognizant of what the deal is, then the prime directive's off. It's like Picard in Star Trek. He comes in and manipulates with stuff all the time, but the people he's usually manipulating with it, where he breaks the prime directive, are aware of it, and he's bringing them up into another echelon of society and matriculation. And so this is that the prime directive can be broken as long as there's a mutual treaty between the two parties. And so once that treaty's signed, then what I call the cosmic game warden, the game warden that patrols this part of our little galaxy here, he won't come down on you and say, Greys, you're out of here. You don't have permission to be here. This is a sovereign planet. And so the premise being that what happened is after we made this deal with the Greys, we didn't like the deal. And we went back to these other aliens that kept coming to see us saying, the Greys gave us a lot of the technology we needed, but they didn't give us the last little crystal micro piezo whatever that would fire up the laser to defend ourselves. We just need this little bit of technology to be able to defend ourselves. Think Star Wars, Reagan's Star Wars. This all supposedly happened right after the Dulce War in the early 1980s. And once again, these aliens to their overlords or whatever petitioned the Grand Master of the Game Warden of this portion of the galaxy. And I think if this is true, I think the request was granted. And they in fact did say, okay, here's this crystal microchip you need. Go ahead and defend yourselves from the Greys. That started to take place right as about the time that Star Wars went from a gray project to a black project to a deep black project. That's always what they do. Right before they'll fund it publicly and operational, and then they'll cut the funding and pay for it with drug money. And so...
You're 153.
Okay, so like 2 minutes, no questions, we'll be done. And so... So the premise was that so some of these other species, some of them maybe more the benevolent ones, who didn't like us at first, but who, after many decades, become very good friends with our species, and work with us and help humanity, raise consciousness. And so one other thing that I want to get back to about the Greys, I think genetic engineering and the whole genome project, HIV, AIDS, Ebola, you name it, the bird flu, whatever it is, it's going to kill us all. I think all that technology was given to us by the ETs. Now, whether that was given to us so we could kill ourselves off with it and they could take over the planet later remains to be seen. But it's obvious that we were getting that technology from somewhere, and the thoughts with the thought of population control. And so that's another whole lecture in itself, probably 40 hours on that one alone, on the different, all the different stuff. Hep C is probably what's going to kill us all, by the way, because it's so highly contagious. You can get Hep C from eating at a restaurant because somebody hasn't washed their hands. And so basically, in 30 years, we'll all be dead of liver disease. But, at least this tape will be on Google. Okay, so that's the premise of basically the whole so-called alien agenda in a nutshell, is that the aliens came, they wanted our DNA, we gave them technology supposedly, and then they got out of hand. We petitioned to basically the game warden of this planet, and he agreed. And then once we got the little tidbit that we needed, we basically You know, we're able to defend ourselves, and now you don't see the grays, you don't see the flying, you don't hear about the abductions, not as many. You don't, military now. You don't hear about the stuff that they used to hear about in the 70s because we got the keys to the kingdom now. And we've basically regained our airspace. And that's why all these videos that Jaime Maussan shows and all that stuff, I think it's all man-made. I think that we have the technology now. We can go to Mars in 3 minutes. We can go to Centauri. We can do it. It's just once again been suppressed on this planet for whatever reason. And so with that, before we run out of tape, I think that should do it. And once again, I got books, videos. Go to my websites, lostartsmedia.com. Search on Google Video, and we'll see you all later.
What are your videos?